I'll pass it off to Connor in just a minute, but just to introduce myself, I'm Jacey Tosh with the Texas A&M Forest Service. I'm our state conservation education coordinator based out of our headquarter office here in College Station. So if there's opportunities in the future that you'd like to connect with foresters after the fact to have them work directly with your teams, that's something that I can help you set up. And Connor's going to walk us through the information that your students are going to need to cover today.
Thanks, Jacey. Yeah, like Jacey said, my name is Connor Murnane. I'm a district forester in our Conroe office. I've worked for the Texas A&M Forest Service for about 3 years now. Done a few Envirothon trainings, everything like that. So today I'm just going to go over a brief overview of what your students would need to know for Envirothon. First up is just some definitions. Silviculture is going to be the growing and tending of trees. Typically, when a landowner purchases property in East Texas, they come into a fully grown pine tree stand or hardwood stand, and they're typically looking at the harvesting stage in forest management. After the harvesting stage, you need to look at a site preparation for the next phase of regeneration. We're going to go into a few site preparation practices and techniques that can be done. Regeneration, there are different practices for regeneration as far as natural or artificial practices of regeneration. And then there are also intermediate treatments, things that you can be doing to help improve the growth of your timber prior to final harvesting operation. So when looking at a stand of trees or a forest in general, you can somewhat tell the different age cohorts in a stand. So if you come across a pine plantation, you typically find this even age stand canopy profile, meaning that all the trees within it are approximately the same age. You will get some natural regeneration underneath those as time goes on, but these were typically all planted artificially, meaning that they were the seedlings were grown and planted either by hand or machine, and you have one aged cohort within the stand itself. As opposed to even aged stand canopy profile, you also have an uneven age system. This is typically what you will find in a majority of East Texas, where stands are just growing naturally in the environment. You have very mature climax species of 100+ foot pine trees. Underneath them, you have naturally regenerated pine and hardwoods underneath that. Methods of regeneration. These are going to be natural regeneration methods. And the first one we talk about is seed tree production. So during a harvesting operation, the best, biggest, tallest, fewest branching trees are left on the site, and these will provide the next generation of seedlings that will grow underneath them. Again, seed trees are definitely your biggest, tallest, and best looking trees on the property. These then will hopefully produce the next biggest and best trees in the next age cohort after that. As opposed to shelterwood, shelterwood is similar to seed tree. Looking at seed tree, you approximately have 6 to 10 trees per acre. Shelterwood is just a higher density seed tree production. So shelterwood, you're probably looking at maybe 15 to 20 trees per acre producing the next age cohort. Those seed trees are identified. The stand is then cut. After the next generation has naturally started growing, you come back in and remove the seed trees to reduce competition amongst the younger generation. Artificial regeneration. So again, this is going to be, you purchase the seedlings, they are grown, you can buy them either bare root or containerized. Containerized is going to be a little bit more expensive, but they are grown in the ground longer, and they come with a cloud of soil around them if you've ever seen a containerized pine seedling. There are numerous different types of seedlings that you can purchase. You can get them dipped in all sorts of treatments to help prevent disease or insects. And you can also get them, you can determine, genealogy of the parent and father trees and all sorts of different things here. When you are doing artificial regeneration, there is a lot of site preparation involved. That can be clearing the site of slash and doing it some sort of prescribed burning method or chemical herbicide to help reduce competition amongst the next generation that's planted. Machine planting is done, you typically attach a planter on the back of like a tractor or a bulldozer. There's a guy that sits in the back of the machine. You'll see him here. And this guy right here, he sits on the back of the machine, and he simply just drops the trees in the ground, the seedlings in the ground at a certain spacing that's been identified. As opposed to hand planting here, you'll see the kids here putting the new containerized seedlings in the ground. Hand planting can be beneficial if there's like a lot of debris or slash left on the property. That kind of makes machine planting not really possible. Prescribed burn, again, can be a useful site prep practice. It can also be used intermediately when it most often is done. What are the purposes and benefits of prescribed burning? It helps manage the undesirable vegetation or unwanted hardwood or brush components in the understory. This understory component can restrict growth in the forest floor and can outcompete your pine seedlings or whichever trees you're trying to grow. If you happen to live in Southeast Texas, this is a particular problem with yaupon, and is our probably #1 targeted species that we're trying to get rid of in the understory. Also helps improve wildlife habitat. Wildlife species love a nice clear understory. They also love an edge effect, so a transition from a forested environment to maybe an open pasture or open prairie, kind of pocket prairie environment. They love that kind of transitional phase across the landscape. Also helps reduce fuel loading. This is extremely important for wildfire prevention, reducing the amount of available fuels for fire to burn in the forest. Also helps promote aesthetics and accessibility throughout the property. Again, also used as a site preparation tool to help remove the site of any competition or unwanted vegetative or herbaceous species. Streamside management zones, you'll see these mentioned in what we call the best management practices. These are voluntary practices that landowners can implement on their property. And for certain third-party certifications for wood product producers, they are required to purchase sustainably grown timber. So if you see certification bodies like FSC, which is Forest Stewardship Council, or SFI, Sustainable Forestry Initiative, you'll often see these logos on like notebooks, or you'll see them on like a Starbucks cup or something like that. I think I've seen them. And these are third-party certification boards that endorse the sustainable growing of timber in their lands. And streamside management zones are a critical component of best management practices. Essentially, you are protecting the stream sides along water bodies to help preserve water quality, reduce sedimentation runoff, all sorts of things like that, things that could pollute the water bodies and create a toxic environment for fish, aquatic species, as well as drinking water. Forests in Texas, they are typically defined by their age and size class and species mixture, as well as their soils. I believe TPWDs, typically this image here has 11 ecoregions in Texas. I typically see 10. Of course, the piney woods in East Texas is the most well-known forested cover type in the state. But there are other different areas of forest in the state as well, going into the cross timbers as well as the Trans-Pecos. You will also find ponderosa pine and Douglas fir in the Trans-Pecos. These are species you typically find in Rocky Mountain regions in farther western states, but there is a small population of those species in the Trans-Pecos area. Kind of a cool, neat fact about forests in Texas. In East Texas, the species mixture of pine is what we call the southern yellow pines. 4 big ones being loblolly, shortleaf, longleaf, and slash pine. You will typically find these in upland sandy soils. And then typically in East Texas, you will find larger hardwood components in bottomland forests. So these are bogs and swamps, especially found in like Northeast Texas near Caddo Lake area. Find them mid-slope as well, and sometimes in the upland components. Successional stages of forests in Texas are divided by pioneer, subclimax, and climax species. The yaupon, of course, is going to be like a dominant pioneer species, if not controlled. Will outcompete natural regeneration of your climax species, which would be pine in East Texas, of course. Okay, so tree measurements. There's a lot of different measurements that you can take with trees, and a lot of different tools that are required in forestry to help assist you with these measurements. Measuring heights of trees, that can be done. You'll typically take 2 measurements in forestry. When you're measuring trees, that will be total height, so total height of the tree itself. And then you will also take heights and merchantable heights. So this is going to be, there are limits to what the mills can take, and the merchantable height is often typically capped at a certain diameter size, or if there's a crook or a swoop in the tree itself and the trunk, that will kind of determine your cutoff point for merchantable height. Kind of takes a little bit of practice to get used to identifying where merchantable height would be at, but it can sometimes be obvious if there's like a big swirl of branches at some point or something like that. Heights is typically measured with a clinometer. You can sometimes see folks that do it more often. They will have a digital hypsometer or a vertex. This essentially uses like a sonar sound wave and detects heights of trees for you. Definitely a handy tool to have. But more often than not, you will use a clinometer or a Biltmore stick. Those can be easily made. And then you just stand back and measure the amount of logs you can get out of that tree. Diameter at breast height, often is expressed as dBH. This is measured at 4.5 feet above the ground on the tree trunk itself. You can measure dBH through a diameter tape, or a logger's tape is what we call it sometimes. This will be your diameter tape here, or you can use a logger's tape, which has distance and also diameter on the other side. Or you can also use calipers like this tool here. This can be useful, especially if the tree is covered in poison ivy and you're not trying to wrap your tape around the tree. Calipers are a huge benefit there when dealing with poison ivy or vines or something like that. Age of the tree is determined using an increment bore. This tool here this is what we call the bit here at the end, and then you have the handle. And then there's also a spoon inside of the bit here. It all fits nicely into the handle itself. You snap it in place back here, and then you want to place your bit at the center of the tree, again at that 4.5 feet point. And it's important here that you at least get halfway or center of the tree with the increment bore itself, because when we take the core out, we want to make sure that we hit that year 1, year 0 point in the center of the tree, so that we can count the approximate amount of rings in the tree itself. There are some more pictures here coming up, and I'll show you all that. But looking at the core that you pull from the increment bore will help you determine growth rate over the past years. You can also see if there's been some sort of disturbance. You can often see fire scars or some sort of insect outbreak in your growth rings. And then sometimes it's also important to be able to calculate basal area. I'll go over that here in a couple more slides, and then calculating trees per acre. Okay, so this is looking again at total heights versus merchantable heights. You'll see here total height is taken at the very top of the tree. Merchantable height here is probably when it starts forking off at this swirl of branches here is probably where they called it at. It can also be determined by a minimum diameter size that the mills will stop taking. But typically, if you start seeing a lot of branching and things like that, the wood quality is no longer useful, and you'll stop it there. Picture down here is an example of what you would see looking through a clinometer on the percent side. So it's important when you're looking at your clinometer, you know which side you're looking at, and it will tell you on the side of the clinometer itself if you're looking at the percent scale or the traditional 66 feet scale. So if you stand back 66 feet. That's when you would take your measurements. But on the percent scale, you can stand at 100 feet and it will be okay, or you can stand at 50 feet and multiply by 2. So if you look down, so you'll look straight on at the tree and you'll get a measurement there. So first off, you want to look down at the base of the tree. This will give you a negative number. Here it's saying -5. And then after you've taken your bottom measurement, you want to go look all the way up to the top of the tree here, and that will tell you your positive number here of 90. You add the two together to give you total height. Diameter at breast height, again, is measured at 4.5 feet from the ground on the trunk of the tree. You can see this forester here using the logger's tape here to measure that. There can be some confusion sometimes, especially if you're on a hill or a slope, which side you're supposed to take it on. But diameter at breast height is always taken on the uphill side of the tree itself. If you do happen to run into some sort of conch or burl on the trunk itself, just go above that point and measure as close as you can above that point. If you have 2 different forking trees like this, you measure both of them and count them as 2 separate trees. Diameter at breast height can also be measured with a logging scale stick or a traditional yardstick. You just hold it up to the side of the tree. on two different points, and then take your average of the diameter from there. So looking at the increment bore again, you want to make sure that the bore itself is within the center of the tree, and then you essentially just start turning into it. Once you have hit the center of the tree here, so we want to hit like this point, we would want to get the bit at least to this point here. It's probably useful to keep on going. You can always hold the spoon up to the side of the tree and make sure that you're at that point that you want to get at. After you've hit that point, you do two counter rotations off the handle itself to cut the core, and then you will be able to pull the spoon out and you'll get a core sample looking somewhat like this. You'll be able to look at things like growth rates. So as you can see kind of spacing within the rings here, this is a sign of very good growth. So this would be 2 separate years of growth here versus this tree cookie here. You can see the rings are tightly spaced, especially as the tree gets older itself. You can kind of see just how tight those rings are getting, which is indicative of poor growth or some sort of too much competition within the stand itself or something like that. After a thinning operation, like a large-scale forestry operation, you'll typically see these rings start getting wider and wider, just because of reduction in competition and availability of resources. Basal area is what we use as an indicator of density in a forest. It's expressed as square feet per acre. And to measure basal area, you use a tool called a prism. Prisms come in different factors. Most common factor to use is going to be a factor of 10. So you will hold the prism up to your eye, about your arm's length away from you. And it's important to define your plot center. You will have different types of plots depending on what your cruising standard is. But typically you'll find that most common or not is 1/20th acre, which is 26.33 foot radius around yourself, around plot center. So the prism itself is held over plot center, and as you look through it, you will see a refracted viewing of the tree trunk itself. So you would count a tree that the trunk, you would count this tree here with the trunk touching the top and bottom portions of the non-refracted view. You would count that tree as in. If the refracted portion is spread far away from the trunk, you would not count that. So this tree right here, I would count this one as one tree being in. I would count this one as out. And then sometimes you will get borderline trees that fall just along this line here. And then when you get that point, you'll have to walk out to it, make sure that the center of the tree is within your defined plot radius. And then if it is, you count typically every other tree. So I'll count this one, the next one I won't count, etc., etc. Basal area is good. So anything above 100. So if you say your basal area is over 100, that is telling you that your forest or your stand is too dense and you need to look at doing some clearing or some thinning operations. Ideal basal area for East Texas would be somewhere in the 60 to 70 square foot per acre range. Principles of tree ID, and the differences are vast. I think we're all familiar with them. Of course, the reproductive structures, whether that be cones, flowers, or fruiting bodies. Habitats are range expressed in the ecoregions of Texas. Tree form, you'll find excurrent forms, so a dominant leader trunk such as pine trees or conifers. And then you have like Baldcypress as well as a good excurrent, or you'll have decurrents such as live oaks are a good decurrent where their branches spread out wider than they grow up taller, and they lack kind of a dominant trunk. It's hard to tell where that dominant leader is. Tree ID is also useful, twigs and buds are also useful in identifying trees, especially in this time of the year during winter when there is no leaves on hardwoods in particular. I've seen a few leaves coming out, but still knowing your twigs, knowing your buds, whether they be alternate branching or opposite branching, if they have simple leaves or compound leaves. When looking at leaves, this whole thing right here is the leaf itself, and then the individual leaflets here are on the leaf there. So definitely a very useful thing to know, especially during winter, is knowing your twigs and your buds. Another useful tip for winter in particular is knowing the bark. Obviously, I think people are well aware of what pine bark looks like. You also get things like this tree here that think this is a lace bark elm or musclewood, pretty identifiable. But yeah, always good to know what your bark looks like, helps you identifying certain species of trees. Leaf shape is a big tool for tree ID, of course, and these differences are vast in tree and leaf shape, especially at the bases and tips, and the parts, looking at veination, the petioles and apexes, things like that. You have needle-like, so you'll find these on your conifers, your pine trees. Scale-like, this will be like your junipers will do this right here, and your deciduous broad and flat leaf hardwoods like this. Leaf arrangement, we talked about this already, but you have simple leaves, you have compound leaves, alternate and opposite branching here. And then this can also occur within compound leaves, alternate and opposite branching like this. Leaf shape, heart shaped here, and you have, so you see lobed and oval. So this is what you see like on a willow oak. You'll have a white oak here is lobed. Heart shaped, you'll see eastern redbud, the tree has nice pink flowers on it will have heart shaped leaves. Deltoids, you'll see these probably not as common as the other ones. Oval, really good. This is pretty much what you'll see on all live oaks is oval looking leaves. Leaf margin, this is going to be the edge of the leaf itself. You have different variations here as far as smooth or toothed or bristle tipped. Definitely useful in helping identify the oaks in particular. There are other leaf parts. You have fans and palms like dwarf palmetto. Feather-like, this would be baldcypress. Your pines here, junipers, and other cypress species. And then you have simple opposite, simple alternate, and the compound opposite, compound alternate leaf shapes and leaf structures. Looking at baldcypress in particular, if you're not familiar with this species, this is a pretty unique species in Texas, is what we call a deciduous conifer. Most conifers are evergreen, but baldcypress is a conifer that loses its leaves every year. You'll see it shed all of its leaves will turn brown or red, and then it will drop all of its needles at once. And then put on a new flush of growth in springtime. So definitely a unique, there's only a certain amount of conifers that are deciduous, and it's kind of a unique species here in Texas to have is the baldcypress species. Looking at new and exciting things happening in forestry is the application and use of UAS systems, unmanned aerial systems, or drone technology. Drones in forestry can be very useful and very beneficial, especially in wildfire operations. A lot of our drones nowadays that we're using have thermal or heat detecting cameras, and this can be useful for determining hot spots or smoking debris that's along the line of the fire. Also useful for forestry operations and identifying forest insect outbreaks, wildlife habitat assessments, and also looking at post-wildfire recovery and regeneration post-wildfire damage. This is kind of a useful, cool thing. It's a drone that helps with prescribed fire burning operations called the Ignis system. Essentially, it's a drone that drops flammable ping pong balls from its hopper. And so traditionally, in operations like that, a helicopter is used, but this kind of drone here, you can map out where you want to drop these ping pong balls at, and you don't have to run the risk of putting somebody up in a helicopter and endangering them. So if you have time, definitely look that up. It's called the Ignis. It's very cool looking technology. Are there any questions or anything like that? Or Jacey, did you want to fill in anything after?
I don't have anything to add other than I dropped a couple links in the chat as well as my email. So if you'd like to practice with a forester in your area, just let me know and we can get that set up. We do have some COVID restrictions in place, but if we have parties that are less than 10, we can still do something with you guys, especially if it's outside. If there are any other resources that you can't find on our website or on like Parks and Wildlife websites, just let me know that as well. And I can try to look for what we have or find some additional links for you. And then we can share the presentations as well.
So Jacey, you said that that the teachers would be able to possibly use some of that equipment. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, so we do, our foresters have forestry tools and we do have some left over at the College Station office. So if your team would like to practice with the forestry tools, I know it's kind of hard to get our hands on those. They're kind of expensive sometimes. So we do have a stash of that we can use. Just let me know and we'll get that set up and get them sent out to that forester ahead of time.
They will
So
cut
you
tree
want-
cookies for you too, if you need tree cookies cut.
I'm sorry, do you loan them out to the schools, or they go with the forester?
They'll go with the forester, and then we'll set up a time that the team can meet with the forester. They'll come out and do some hands-on practice.
Okay, and you have foresters for all over
Yes.
Texas that you're the contact person for, that they can contact you to find somebody?
Yeah, just send me an email. Let me know that I'm interested in having somebody come out, and then I'll find the forester nearest to where you are, and we'll get that set up.
Yeah, my students learned how to use clinometers last year, and each one of them learned how to use a borer, and they loved that. They still talk about that, and they're wanting me to call y'all again to come out again. But the guy that came out also had an extra Biltmore staff, so we got one that's now ours. So totally worth it, totally.
We collect these things because we never really get rid of them. So if we have foresters that have moved on, or we just have older tools that we've kind of cycled out and then replaced with that newer model, we do have those for education now. So plenty to go around if we need them.
Okay, which something that has been coming up increasingly is urban forestry, which you didn't really touch on in your talk. And especially as a lot of our students come from urban and suburban areas rather than rural areas, trees in their community are probably what they're more familiar with than silviculture. Does the Forest Service also deal with urban forestry, or is that a completely different sector of the industry?
You're welcome to take that one if you'd like. Or
Yes, as well as rural district foresters in East Texas, we do have urban foresters assigned to the major urban areas of the state as well. They can assist you with these Envirothon and general urban forestry. Urban forestry and rural forestry can be very, very different as far as species composition, the soil structure that's within urban environments, things like that. But yes, we do have urban foresters as well.
It's a rather interesting budding field. It used to be that urban forestry was, you kind of had to argue for it, and not every state had something available, but now it's kind of accepted as the norm. Like we do need urban forestry. It does serve a very specific and useful purpose in maintaining our city's trees, especially after natural disasters or things that come through. We need to have that inventory established ahead of time. Helps us know how to best replant, and then we can apply for grants from like the EPA as such to be able to come into cities and actually get that infrastructure back up.
Is there anything else from the teachers that you think would be helpful that your students struggle with?
There are numerous different scales that those forestry tools come in. So make sure that you know which kind of tool and what kind of scale that you're using on that tool. Because they come in, 10th inches, things like that. And if it's a bunch of hand-me-down equipment, you could have multiple different scales across multiple different tools. So if you do happen to have some equipment like that, definitely recommend getting with a local forester. Feel free to contact myself or Jacey for their contact info, and they can kind of walk you through the different scales of each tool.
Yeah, I think we had that issue before because we use sometimes Texas Envirothon competition, we use a different clinometer than maybe the students had been taught on. And so that's something that they really need to be aware of.
Yeah, I think that's the most common issue I see with the students and kind of their struggles with it is just the different scales and the different tools.
Yeah,
Is-
I think
is
a couple
there-
years ago.
Is
Oh,
there
I'm
like
sorry.
for the Texas one, can you tell us exactly what scales you use? Like, is that out there somewhere so we don't mess up, because we have a lot of hand-me-down stuff?
So in let's take the diameter tape, for instance. You'll typically find that in 10th inches. The clinometer is going to be I don't have one in here right now.
I'll have to look and see what we have as well, because that's usually that's what we do the test with, is the equipment that we have. I think that John Boyette wrote that down for us at one point, but I don't remember.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think we've got some that are percentage and some that are degrees. Does that sound right?
Yes, and there'll be some that are dependent on how far back you stand from the tree. So again, percentage would be your 100-foot, and then the degrees one could be the 66-foot one. But
Okay. Okay, can I ask one final question? I should probably already know the answer to this, but when foresters are out talking about trees, do you usually use the scientific names or do you usually use the common names?
if it's with a landowner, I'm typically using the common name. If we're talking amongst forester to forester, we're usually using the scientific name. There is such variation in common names depending on
Right.
regions of the country, the world that you're in. For instance, sugarberry can also be called hackberry to some folks, depending on where you are, the same tree. Pines get, especially if once you start getting into variations or cultivars of pine, can get strange common names as well. But yeah, if it's typically a landowner or something like that, or general public, I'm typically using the common name. But forester to forester, or it's a scientific name.
What do the kids need to know for the competition?
I thought you
both?
might ask that.
They're probably gonna have to know both, I would guess.
Yeah, some of them, the more common ones, I think we've asked to identify by scientific name, at least the genus on some of them in the past. You know what? Maybe we should get a list of the common ones out to send to you guys so that the students have that information on if they would need to know that or not.
Yes. Or what we've sometimes done is, if they've been identified, to ask the treat a species using the scientific name, we have actually left a resource out for them to look it up rather than memorizing it. We've done that as well, but they need to identify it to common name and then look up the scientific name.
The Tree ID app and the Trees of Texas website, the links that I dropped in the chat here, they'd use both names. So it's a good way to practice there.
Yes. I mean, we want to make it competitive, but we don't want to make it too off-putting. So it's just a fine line we have to draw.
Our Tree ID app is very good. I also use Seek by iNaturalist for Tree ID. It is a very useful tool. It does it and identifies it in real time for you.
What is it called?
Seek, SEEK. I'll put it in the chat for you. It's in the App Store though.
All right. Well, our students aren't allowed to use these apps on the actual test, but certainly for training and practicing, that will be very useful for them. So
it will give you the scientific name as well. So.
Is that just for iPhones or can any phones get it?
I think Seek is on Android and iPhone as well.